The proceeding is currently suspended.
Well, good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming this morning to help us. We much appreciate that. Professor Taylor, Professor Greenwood, and Professor Dodds. Thank you very much for helping us this morning, and we're looking forward to this session. So if I might start with Lord Mitchell, and please can I ask the committee members and our witnesses to be brief in answers, because I've got to manage time to about 7 to 8 minutes per question. Lord Mitchell.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for coming here today. I'm sure everybody else is trying to get a handle on where we actually stand, where the UK stands in the world with respect to battery and fuel cell development and research and development. So the questions I would really like to ask is, in which aspects of battery and fuel cell research are we focusing on in this country? And what have been the major influences for the past 20 years that have led to where we are today? And is the current R&D activity focused on lower TRL level research or demonstration projects? And do we have enough demonstration projects? I throw it open.
Who'd like to take it first, please?
I'm happy to kick off if that helps.
Yes, please.
So first of all, in terms of the balance between the battery and fuel cell research and development, I think this was echoed by the tail end of the comments I heard at the previous session, which is that the UK has a much stronger and better funded activity around batteries at the moment than it does around fuel cells. The balance of that at the moment on batteries is actually quite reasonable between the early TRL university research, which predominantly tends to focus on chemistry and materials, with some Innovate UK type activities to help companies look at the innovation piece, and then also things like the Automotive Transformation Fund, which looks at the commercialization piece. So actually the Faraday Challenge and the activities around it gives us a very good mechanism by which to push all of those things forward in concert. Then you could argue that there are two issues with that at the moment. One is longevity of funding and the visibility of that over a long period of time. I think I heard Tony speak in the previous session about the fact that this is a 5 to 10 year journey, not a 1 year sprint. And unfortunately, some of those mechanisms only have funding visibility of 1 or 2 years at the moment. And the second issue is probably around quantum. So if you look at things like the Automotive Transformation Fund, which is there to encourage investment in gigafactories, a single gigafactory is somewhere between 2.5 and 4 billion pounds of investment. And I think the total fund at the moment there is around 400 million, which compared, coming back to Lord Krebs' question from the previous session, if you compare that with the scale of what's happening in Europe, we've got a little way to go on that, I think.
Yes, please.
Okay, so my name is Paul Dodds. I am Professor of Energy Systems at UCL, and I specialize in whole economy energy system models. But I'm also a member of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Supergen Hub, where I lead on socioeconomics. And so I'd like to take the fuel cell angle to this question.
Okay.
So if we look at the data, and by the data I mean the number of patents that have been granted and the number of journal publications that have been produced in this area, and I don't have separate ones for fuel cells from hydrogen, so I'm talking about hydrogen and fuel cells here. If we look at that data, it tells us that the UK is more or less followed global trends for the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, when the fuel cells were receiving a huge amount of hype, the focus for research and development was very much on developing a cheaper and more reliable product and trying to commercialize it. And that didn't happen because the fuel cells were too expensive compared to alternatives. Now, in the intervening period, great strides have been made. Patent analysis actually shows that there's now been a shift in the last few years from fundamental innovation on fuel cells to actually system integration, so putting fuel cells into things. We've seen a big reduction in the number of patents on fuel cells themselves, the core technology, and a big increase on the integration side. And the UK has pretty much followed these international trends. Investment has been a lot lower in the UK compared to the USA, to Japan, Korea, and latterly China. And so we've seen that the UK's had far fewer patents being granted and fewer papers have been published. And if you look at the relative number of papers for the UK and the world in this area, it's almost, the two lines are almost exactly on top of each other. It's quite amazing actually. So another thing maybe to note is that the UK has a smaller proportion of journal papers that are co-authored between academia and industry than, for example, Japan, which might suggest that maybe we need to link academia and industry together a bit better. And that's something that other countries have maybe done a little bit better in the past. Saying that, the UK generally hasn't invested in energy technologies at all, and it's relatively stronger in hydrogen fuel cells than it is in other energy technologies compared to competitors. It's got a talented science base, and the papers it does produce are quite highly cited, although it built up quite an advantage in the early 2000s, and that hasn't continued into the 2010s. So the citations have gone down a bit with more recent papers. Maybe if I finish off, we did a survey of fuel cell companies in the UK in 2019, or the whole sector. We found 20 UK companies involved in fuel cells and another 13 involved in materials. So something that wasn't really discussed much in the last section is that a lot of the focus in the UK is on fuel cell materials and on building stacks rather than building end-use products. And that's an area in which the UK does have some world-leading specialisms. But there's also a strong engineering integration focus that historically has been a strength of the UK in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Taylor, do you have any comments?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Professor Taylor from the University of Bristol. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise, and I'm also the Director of the Supergen Energy Networks Hub. I wanted to just pick up on the focus part of the question and also the demonstration part of the question. So I would say that in the UK, we have focused on battery technology and battery technology predominantly for the automotive sector in terms of the fundamental material science and development work. And clearly a very important use for battery technology is also in grids to help us with the decarbonisation of our energy networks and energy systems. And what we've been quite good at in that space is demonstration. So through Ofgem's Low Carbon Networks Fund, we've been able to demonstrate grid scale energy storage in the UK pretty successfully at large scale to show how it can help integrate renewable energy. And there'll be more work required there. We've even developed dedicated markets like enhanced frequency response market to pull on battery technology at the grid scale. However, I think there's a bit of a disjoint between what's happening at the fundamental level with battery technology research and grid requirements. So we've heard earlier today, a lot of the targets are around the size, the energy density and the weight. And that's because we're thinking predominantly about transport applications where size and weight really matters. But if you've got a stationary grid scale energy storage application, the requirements for power and energy are quite different. And also, if it's a little bit heavier, that doesn't really matter so much. And if it takes up a larger footprint, that doesn't matter quite so much. So a lot of the work needs to start to think about grid applications, grid services, and the trade-offs there so that we're not just developing batteries that are small and lightweight, because that's not the primary requirement for grids.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Baroness Manningham-Buller, please.
Thank you, Lord Chair. I'm getting I don't know whether other panel members or other committee members are, I'm getting a mixed picture of some really substantial success and movement with the Faraday Challenge, but at the same time, much less investment than some of our competitors. The last panel wasn't sure that we should worry too much about competition with others, but I'd like to ask, starting with you, Professor Dodds, where do you think we rate in our research into battery and fuel cells compared to other countries? That's my sort of first question. My second question is, rather than trying to cover the suite of things that can help us get to net zero, Should the UK play to its strengths and seek to specialise, given we can't compete on all fronts, given the investment levels? So the first one is really, how do we compare? And secondly, should we focus or try and cover the lot?
So historically, I can talk more about fuel cells again than batteries. Historically, our competitors have invested far more in fuel cells than we have, particularly in Japan, China, and Korea. And that's for both stationary and for mobility applications, transport. So from memory, I think Japan, in its micro CHP program, it invested about $250 million per year over a sustained period, just in micro CHP development and deployment within the market for learning by doing. And so I think the UK would struggle to catch up in markets like that. So for example, for designing fuel cell cars, there's been advanced programs in East Asia in particular, and the UK is unlikely to catch up unless it can produce some sort of revolutionary design. Now, there are some companies that have been trying that in the UK, so notably River Simple was tried to design a fuel cell car from the ground up rather than trying to adapt an existing car to use fuel cells, which is a really interesting approach, and it actually might be successful. There are other revolutionary technologies. So Ceres Power, I think you talked to Nigel Brandon in a particular session. And Ceres Power is one of the companies that he spun out. And that's an example of a UK company which really has quite a revolutionary fuel cell technology in it, in terms of making micro CHP fuel cells cheaper. So the Japanese program has had a very strong focus on evolution and manufacturing and learning by doing. But the way that they make the fuel cell in Ceres is quite different and could achieve a substantial cost reduction. But
yeah, go on.
I was going to say, but Ceres needed to actually go abroad to commercialize it. It struggled to get funding within the UK, and in the end, it's partnered with a number of overseas countries, particularly in Asia. And the UK government sees no role for micro CHP fuel cells. So my view is that the UK needs to specialise and focus on the small number of areas where it has strengths relative to competitors.
Okay, and not try and catch up with others.
Not in those areas. I think
I'd like to give other panel members a chance to see if they agree with you or not. Thank you, Professor Greenwood.
So to answer your question, we've got to think about what we're competing for, because in answering to the UK taxpayer, I'm much more comfortable talking about value creation, job creation, employment, GVA, and so on, than citations of papers, which are a means to an end. And the competition in the battery industry that the UK is looking for is to be manufacturing the batteries that go into the cars and the grid energy storage that we're going to be deploying over the next few decades. And we're not really going to be competing against predominantly Asian manufacturers for that, because the economics and logistics of the battery industry are that you don't want to be manufacturing that product a long way away from where you're manufacturing the vehicles or the grid energy storage. So actually, we need to be thinking quite carefully about what we do to get the industrialization and commercialization. That's the real competitive ground that we're in right now. R&D is an attractor to companies to come to the UK, and it helps them to improve their products over time. But actually, it's about the immediate market demand and how easy and cost effective it is to build factories and supply companies here. And that brings me to your point about focus. One of the reasons that the Faraday Battery Challenge has been successful, I would argue, is it set off with a very clear focus. And to begin with, that focus was automotive batteries. And to be fair, the automotive battery market is at least a factor of 10 times bigger than the grid energy storage market. So helping the academic communities, the industrial communities, and linking into the government policy with a very clear aim as to where we wanted to get to, which was large-scale manufacturing of batteries for cars in the UK, really helped to build the momentum and to get the linkages between universities and between universities, companies, and governments. If we talk about hydrogen and fuel cells, we need to ask ourselves the same question: where should we be focusing to deliver the best value for the economy? I would say for passenger cars, almost all manufacturers now have stopped looking at fuel cells as a passenger car technology. We still have Toyota, BMW, and Jaguar Land Rover have a research program in the UK looking at fuel cells, but for most markets, it's been judged that that will not be a cost competitive technology. Where we are seeing real opportunities, though, is large-scale energy storage and heavy-duty vehicles, things like trucks, trains, and marine applications. And if we create that same level of focus for the fuel cell sector that we were able to do for the battery sector, there's every reason to believe that we could achieve a similar rate of progress. Thank you.
I don't know whether you wish to add anything, Professor Taylor. I can see your hand up, so I think you probably do. So let me come to you. And then I have, if there's time, Lord Chair, I'd just like to ask anyone, member of the panel, say, how can we make the UK more attractive than it is to inward investment? Professor Taylor.
Okay. Professor Taylor, briefly, then briefly the second question.
Okay, so just very briefly on the competition point, I think one of the things that we're in competition internationally on is people and skills. And I think that the funding in the UK is relatively modest compared to other countries. The other thing that's difficult about it is that often things like the Faraday Battery Institute are funded for a short period of time. So as you can see now, all the postdoctoral researchers working in that area at the moment, the funding stops in 2022. And there are jobs all over the world for these highly skilled people to go and take. And so longevity and security and confidence in that funding is really, really important to keep the skills base in the UK.
Thank you.
Professor Greenwood, Professor Dodds, to the second question, very briefly, that Baroness Manningham-Buller asked. Okay, please go.
Yeah, so we did survey hydrogen fuel cell companies a couple of years ago. Other European companies in East Asia were seen as having stronger policy support for hydrogen fuel cells. And Europe, North America, and East Asia were all considered to have a better stock of labour with the appropriate skills. And so they are two areas that I think perhaps we could improve.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I think on the inward investment piece, I think we've actually got a very good mechanism in place now in the UK with DIT working with BEIS and with others, and DEF are also engaged now. So if you think about what's important for a big company wanting to put a battery factory in the UK, you need land, about a square kilometre of it. You need that land to be connected to a power supply of 40 or 50 megawatts, so large scale power supply. You need the skills that Professor Taylor talked about, 2,000 to 3,000 people in total. And you need the supply chain that's ready to step in and support. And actually, the UK government's put some really good joined up mechanisms in place to create that offer for companies looking to the UK. There's one other element that's needed, and that is that countries around the world are bidding to get this business landed in their territory because they recognise that early investments now will be the nucleus for growth in the future. So this is not a level playing field. There are incentives played across the world in different forms, and we need to make sure that we're competitive in that in order to land those early investments that will grow later. The aspect of longevity of funding visibility, which Professor Taylor raised, is absolutely critical. Industry has to make its business decisions over 5 and 10-year time periods for this. So having funding mechanisms that are decided on an annual basis within government doesn't necessarily give them the longevity to make confident long-term investments. And that clarity over a 5 to 10-year period would actually crowd in private sector investment alongside what government is doing, where if we only fund it in short-term sprints, inevitably the level of government support will have to be proportionately higher.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lord Krebs, please. Lord Krebs, you might be muted.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I think my questions have largely been answered, but I just want to check that I've understood the answers correctly. So I wanted to ask about how our witnesses feel the Faraday Battery Challenge has been in terms of its success in advancing battery science and applications. And there were two subparts to this, which I think I've heard. In terms of the continuity of research funding, I think in answer to Baroness Manningham-Buller's question, all the witnesses agreed that that's a problem. We need long-term continuity and we don't have it. The second part of the question is concerning whether the battery challenge is focusing largely on the light vehicle transport sector and what read across there is to other sectors like heavy transport or grid storage. And I think Professor Taylor earlier on commented on that. So you have, I think, answered these questions. This is an opportunity for you to add any further points that you'd like to make, and perhaps I could come to Professor Taylor first.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I would say that the Faraday Battery Challenge has been very successful in the area that it is focused in, but I think there's a compelling case for it to look more broadly now and to certainly look further into grid applications, and it should be provided with funding to enable it to do that. We're going to need energy storage in our grids more and more as we add more and more renewable energy in order to keep our grids stable and secure and keep the lights on. So I think that's a really important challenge going forward, and it can be a fairly straightforward expansion of the role of the Faraday Battery Challenge. So I would certainly recommend that.
Professor Greenwood?
So in answer to your question about how good is the Faraday Challenge, let me reflect on it in this way. So I work with colleagues in America and in Germany that have their own national programs, and they are envious of the way in which the UK has managed to build the connections between universities and between universities and industries in a way that they've not been able to do. So in terms of the structure of the mechanism, we should be very proud of what's been done. You're correct in saying that our focus in the Faraday Challenge has been around light vehicles to begin with, and I don't think we should be apologetic about that, because it was that clarity of focus that enabled it to build the momentum that it has in such a relatively short time. Remember, it's only been running for around 4 years in a journey that was originally intended to be at least 10. The Faraday Challenge has already expanded out into working with things like the aerospace sector. And I do think that the grid storage sector is the next logical one for it to expand into over time. But what is important to us as a UK battery community is to keep this centralisation of expertise. The skill sets that you need to develop batteries for these applications are quite similar. If we ended up fragmenting that in a situation where skills shortage is a major problem, then we'll be inefficient in the small activities that would take place. So crowding that activity into Faraday, I think, would be a good thing.
Thank you. Professor Dodds, do you wish to add anything?
Just very briefly, that due to the automotive industry bringing down the costs of batteries, we can now use them for grid-scale storage. And people have been looking to reuse batteries that have been in cars for grid-scale storage when they've degraded by a certain amount. So that's also useful. Maybe the other area we need to think about a lot more is about vehicle-to-grid storage in a way that doesn't overly degrade car battery performances. But essentially, we have a lot of cars sitting on people's drives that could provide energy storage to the system when it's needed, if we could sort out the technology behind that.
Thank you, Lord Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Lord Caker?
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I'd like to turn once again to the question of public funding for research. And I think we've heard in the previous session and in this that battery research has received substantially more funding, by a factor of 10 public funding, than fuel cell research. And I think if I've understood it correctly, the reasons for that were partly in terms of the natural history for the development of these different technologies, with battery technology being at an earlier, more advanced stage previously, and then for a better bet in terms of this type of holistic funding. Is that a correct interpretation in terms of explaining the difference in the rationale for the direction for public funding between batteries and fuel cells? I don't know who'd like to start. Maybe Professor Taylor.
I think your characterization there is true to a great extent, but I think things have changed now. I think we've made a lot of progress with battery technology in the automotive sector for light passenger vehicles. I think that there have been a lot of developments in the broader area of hydrogen and the use of hydrogen to get us to net zero by 2050. Committee on Climate Change assumed that we're going to use around 700 terawatt hours of hydrogen by 2050. So there's a lot of work to do in this space, and I think there's now a good case that could be made for an equivalent to the Faraday Battery Challenge, but around hydrogen and fuel cells as a partner program with lots of overlaps and interactions.
And in terms of providing the necessary focus that we've heard as one of the reasons why the Faraday Battery Challenge has been so successful, do you now believe that a similar focus, I think we've heard potentially in areas such as heavy-duty vehicle use of fuel cells and energy storage more generally, that we're in a position to design something that will have that same focus and therefore deliver potentially in the way that the Faraday Battery Challenge has done, but in this case for fuel cells?
So I think you're right. I think one of the great things about the Faraday Battery Challenge was that the automotive industry came together really effectively to say that they unanimously wanted this and would engage with it. I think for a hydrogen or hydrogen and fuel cells initiative of a similar kind, we'd need to decide, is it going to be about heavy goods vehicles? Is it going to be about trains? Is it going to be about the aviation sector or a mixture thereof? And test that with industry and decide what the focus is or what the first area of focus might be.
Professor Dodds, do you have a view on that and how that conversation might be stimulated to deliver a similarly successful program for fuel cells?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I would agree totally with Phil on this. We had some thought about this a while ago. I mean, fuel cells and battery technologies are to some extent complementary for all vehicles. So all fuel cell cars have batteries in them for hybrid or plug-in hybrid operation. Nobody designs one without batteries. And there's a question. The question is how many. And also, a lot of the expertise around fuel cells is very closely linked to batteries, to the extent that a lot of academics will work in one area or the other depending on the current funding landscape. There's quite a lot of switching within the sector. And so when we came to look at this a couple of years ago, we recommended that we should consider separate hydrogen and electrochemical centres, with the electrochemical centre covering both batteries and fuel cells, and accounting for the similarities between the two types of technologies.
Professor Greenwood, I mean, this point about how funding incentivises research priorities and how academic teams decide to focus their effort. Do you think that in having taken the particular approach with the Faraday Battery Challenge, clearly very successfully, there has been a distortion in terms of academic focus in the fuel cell area? And if that is indeed the case, do you think that we've lost ground as a country and that can be made up?
So first of all, let me just come back to the question you raised at the beginning, which was around why have batteries so seemingly powered ahead and fuel cells have lagged behind a little. And I'd say there's two critical reasons for that. The first is a massive difference in technological progress. Batteries have reduced in cost to 1/10 of what they were a decade ago, and they've doubled in energy density over the same period of time, which has meant they're now capable of serving many of the needs for transport and energy storage applications. And fuel cells, whilst they've progressed, have not done so at quite that same rate. The second thing is that applications have become much more clearly defined for batteries, which has allowed the research community to rally around specific targets and specific activities. And that's why the Faraday has been able to be successful in that. So I think I'd echo some of Professor Taylor's comments, which are, if we want to do the same thing for the fuel cell sector, then we need to do two things. The first is we need a very clear policy on where fuel cells will be applied so that the research community can focus on the right outcomes. And at the moment, there isn't a huge clarity on that. We need the hydrogen policy, and we shouldn't just assume that transport is the only option here. Hydrogen will have a role to play in decarbonisation of heat and probably in seasonal energy storage as well. So we shouldn't take it as assumed that there will be renewable hydrogen available to every application that desires it. Secondly, having got the energy policy in place, then we can start to look at the types of products and their requirements that will come forward. Then we can focus the research community on answering the right questions. I'm not sure that I agree, I'm afraid, with Professor Dodds' view that we should have an electrochemistry centre. The reason that the Faraday has been successful is because of that clarity of purpose and focus. And the challenge that we'd had with the academic community prior to that is that we had organized by discipline. We'd got groups of electrochemists that flexed between fuel cells and batteries according to where the funding calls came. And actually, it's critical for us that we keep a focus on delivery if you want to see this rate of progress. I would be absolutely supportive of an equivalent of Faraday for fuel cells, but it needs to have an industry to be pulled by, which is a relatively small industry in the UK. It needs to have clear targets as to where it's going, and then the researchers can make sure that the work they're doing is well targeted and will ultimately pull through into economic value.
Lord Chairman, if I may, just one further question. With regard to creating the focus that clearly needs to be provided ahead of committing to a sort of Faraday type initiative for fuel cells, is there at the moment any activity in trying to develop that type of focus, develop the energy policy that will attend the rationale for this type of fuel cell investment? And if so, who is leading that? Yes, please.
I think you heard in the previous session that there is an activity happening in the UK around hydrogen policy. And that's critical because that will be the thing that answers the question about which energy vectors in the UK we focus on which sectors. In terms of the bringing of hydrogen and fuel cells into transport applications, I would say that typically the Advanced Propulsion Centre has been probably the main convener of the technology roadmaps for that sector and is now sponsoring projects. In fact, there were some announced even just this week where they'll be encouraging the development of hydrogen fuel cell buses with Wrightbus, for instance. That all came through recently. I would say that, though, that there is not quite in the same way that we don't have a Faraday institution today that has pulled the industrial and academic communities together around hydrogen. I think the Supergens have done a good job of bringing the academic communities together, but we do need to see something that's a bit stronger around bringing an industrial and policy community into the same place.
And how might that be achieved? How could that be led or stimulated?
So in the case of if I take the batteries and automotive markets, that came together because industry saw a clear need. The order of events was quite simple. We signed up to climate policies. The climate policies took us into CO2 requirements. That put in a requirement onto manufacturers to develop products that were compliant, which meant the manufacturers needed technologies and supply chains that would answer them. And so we had to follow that cascade to make sure there's a win-win for every organization down the chain. I don't think we've yet got that clarity of policy in place around applications of fuel cells that means that the industry is there and ready to push the button on the big investments that it will take to bring product to market.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, somebody else wanted to comment.
Professor Dodds, I think.
Professor Dodds?
Okay. I was just going to say that, I mean, fundamentally, the Faraday came around because industry was willing to put in a lot of money. And I absolutely agree that it's not there for fuel cell transport at the moment, and that's an issue. Maybe the focus will be on heavy-duty vehicles, and that's where hydrogen fuel cells will fit in better, maybe on aviation and shipping too. And there's a number of opportunities around there that, but potentially they're longer term and they're a little bit lower TRL than battery vehicles are at the moment.
Okay. My next question is pretty simple. Is the current funding sources likely to meet the R&D goals that the government has set in terms of batteries and fuel cells? Professor Greenwood.
I think for batteries, the answers I gave previously about longevity and quantum notwithstanding, I think the structures that we've got and the way that we're moving are progressing very well towards delivering against the goals that we need. I think for fuel cells, there isn't the equivalent mechanism in place that's driving that level of progress at the moment.
Professor Dodds?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. There isn't a drive on fuel cells. So the government has the target, for example, on new car sales, but I'm not sure if there's an equivalent target on heavy-duty vehicles where you might start to use fuel cells, even though most companies who produce those types of vehicles worldwide are currently looking at fuel cell options and trying to develop fuel cell options.
Professor, anybody else want to comment? Sorry. Professor Taylor.
I think I would agree with Professor Greenwood and Professor Dodds with their comments. One thing I would just say is, going back to Professor Greenwood's earlier comment about using hydrogen for heating, we are in the UK now blending hydrogen into the gas grids to help decarbonise the gas grids and use that for heating. Now, if that ends up being the major use, then the pull on fuel cells won't be so great because we'll just be producing hydrogen through maybe electrolysis or using new nuclear to produce hydrogen that's low carbon, for example, and then using it and distributing it in our gas grids. So there would be a need for more R&D in electrolyzers, maybe, rather than fuel cells. Now, they are similar technologies, and therefore you could, some of the skills are transferable, but it's worth just mentioning electrolyzers there.
If I may follow up just very briefly on Professor Taylor's point, when we think about uses of hydrogen, we must remember that none of these fuel sources come for free, and neither are any of them in infinite supply. If you use renewably generated hydrogen to produce heat, you do so at something like 95% efficiency. In other words, 95% of the renewable energy that you generated finishes up as the heat that you wanted. If you use that same hydrogen to provide torque in an electric vehicle, because of all of the conversion losses that happen in the process, only about 20% of that energy ends up at the point of use. So 80% of the renewable energy we generated is unfortunately wasted on the way to get there. So we do need to think very carefully about which applications are best suited for which fuels.
Okay. If I might change tack slightly, and in last panel we discussed apprenticeship and skills. So I'd like to hear your views about what you think might be required in terms of skills level for, say, a gigafactory by 2000 and what we're talking about, 2030. I see you nodding, Professor Taylor.
I think actually Professor Greenwood's better placed than me to answer this question, if that's okay.
Professor Greenwood. Yeah, so we've actually we're just about to complete a piece of work at the moment. So loosely speaking, to staff a gigafactory needs about 3,000 people. And it's a mixture of skills from shop floor level through manufacturing engineering into sort of laboratory science and technology, and also, of course, managerial skills that are needed to operate that. And we have been working with the Faraday Institution to put together a national skills framework for that, taking into account the number of people that we're going to need at each of those levels and the types of skilling that they need. And we hope very shortly to be releasing that framework, which includes how people would access the training that they need at all different points along that way. What I would say is going to be critical for us in the UK is that we haven't got time to generate all of those skills from scratch, waiting for school leavers to come through a system. We are going to have industries like the car industry where skills that are currently associated with internal combustion engines and their manufacture could be retrained or reskilled to create the industries that we need to make electric motors, batteries, fuel cells, and their balance of plant. So it's important that we don't just look at this as a how do we grow school leavers into the skills we need, but we also think about what the mechanisms will be to take people who are already in industry and retrain them into the new requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Dodds, did you have any comment?
I think there's a range of activities that we have here, from basic research to developing new products to actually running manufacturing plants and to doing end-use service. And so we need a range of people in each, and it depends to some extent exactly how much time we want to actually, how much effort we want to put into each area. So do we want to be a country that is going to essentially import other people's technologies but manufacture it here, or are we trying to get the really high value added activities such as research and development? Because you need very different skills. One set you need a substantial PhD program, which certainly for fuel cells we don't really have. For another set, you're retraining fitters or doing engineers at a different level. So there's a range of different types of skills you need, and I don't think we have a clear view on exactly what we need for exactly which activities we're trying to promote the new.
Thank you very much. Lord Krebs, please.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. I wanted to build on some of the answers you've already given to previous questions by focusing on the gaps that you perceive in the current R&D activities in the UK in relation to both batteries and fuel cell technologies. For example, and you've commented on this a bit before, but do the R&D advances translate across applications? So do the advances in electric vehicles have spillover benefits for grid storage? And I note that, for example, the US Department of Energy in 2016 received a report which suggested that on grids, redox flow batteries and zinc hybrid ion batteries might be used rather than lithium ion batteries as in electric vehicles. And particularly what factors are important in driving research for the development of grid-focused technologies. So perhaps you could consider gaps, and particularly in relation to the grid. Who would like to come first? Professor Greenwood, perhaps.
Thank you. So I would say at the moment, in terms of the research gaps, we've done a very good job on our kind of chemistry, electrochemistry and materials in the battery space. I think there is more to be done on engineering and manufacturing engineering, because that's the thing that will bridge the scientific breakthroughs into the commercial exploitation within the UK. So a bit more focus on those would certainly be beneficial. In terms of the types of batteries and applications for them, I would agree. We need to, I keep coming back to, we need to know what the application is to do the correct research. At the moment, the grid scale storage industry is buying automotive batteries because that's what's there and what's the cheapest, because that has been the first market to move, and it's been frankly where the biggest commercial gains are to be had by the battery manufacturing companies. There is a good argument that says that with the right market and with the right funding mechanisms behind it, different types of batteries, things like lithium sulfur or redox flow batteries, could be a better answer for grid storage. But at the moment, the market dynamics and the investment has not been there to do that. I would say there's one other area of battery technology, which is an area that the UK could be extremely good at, which is an emerging requirement, and that's very high power density batteries. So these are batteries that are not used to store all of the energy that you need for your electric car to drive it from A to B, where it acts a bit like a fuel tank. These are batteries that act as a buffer for energy, short-term demand, and the aerospace industry needs that, the off-highway industry needs it, the rail industry needs it, and actually it's an area that the UK has very good academic strength and actually very good track record as well from work that we've done in motorsport and other applications.
Thank you very much. Professor Taylor, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Thank you. I would agree with Professor Greenwood there. I think that, as Professor Dodds said earlier, there are spillover benefits from the automotive battery developments to grid applications. There's a really interesting project called E for Future, which is with Nissan and National Grid, looking at vehicle-to-grid technologies and using a growing fleet of electric vehicles to stabilize the grid and help it decarbonize. But where the gaps start to appear is at really large-scale energy storage, which we're going to need in our grids as we decarbonize them. And at the moment, lithium-ion technology doesn't really look optimal for those kind of applications. So I think there are some gaps in the funding landscape and in our activities in the UK, looking at those larger scale, longer term energy storage solutions. And also perhaps emphasizing the word energy there rather than electrical storage. We need to think about heat storage and translations between those to help us with our overall energy system.
Thank you. And Professor Dodds?
Yeah, so the largest number of fuel cells that are in operation at the moment are for supporting the grid. So there's hundreds of thousands of micro-CHP fuel cells installed in homes in Japan, generating electricity and providing heat to those homes. So that is actually the main market rather than vehicles at the moment, although in the longer term, vehicles has long been considered the biggest potential market for hydrogen fuel cells. I mean, in terms of what's missing for fuel cells, perhaps fuel cells which are powered using ammonia, particularly for aviation, but potentially also for shipping, trains and heavy goods vehicles. The reason is liquefied ammonia has twice the energy density of liquid hydrogen. It's fairly easy to to transport. I mean, it liquefies at sort of 10 bar or so. And you can produce potentially ammonia from renewables in countries such as Australia, Chile, and Saudi Arabia very cheaply, probably more cheaply than the UK could produce hydrogen. And so I think the aviation sector is starting to take a greater look at ammonia as a fuel, particularly for shorter range or medium range flights up to about 4,000 kilometers. So.
Could I just pick up on that? Because let's suppose that ammonia was developed as a fuel for trains or for short haul flights. Can you convert the existing airplanes and trains to run on ammonia, or do you have to wait to build a new fleet? Just thinking, because the lifespan, let's say, of the high-speed train in this country was, 45 years. So even if you had a new technology to run trains on ammonia, would all those recently bought Hitachi dual fuel trains have to be ditched and buy a new fleet? Professor Dodds, do you wish to come back on that?
Yeah, so I think you'd almost certainly need a new fleet of aircraft. I don't think the existing fleet of aircraft would be able to use ammonia. Trains is an interesting question, and the answer is I'm not sure. So electric trains have a motor generally under each carriage. I mean, potentially, I guess you could power those motors using a fuel cell in a carriage at the front. So perhaps it might be possible to convert existing trains if it were possible to add an extra carriage in.
Okay. Any of the other witnesses wish to comment on those points? Professor Greenwood.
I would certainly agree that there's no way that you'd be able to carry an existing airframe onto this kind of technology. For the aviation industry, it would be a complete new design to do that. I think for the rail industry, I mean, the rolling stock for the most part would remain constant, and you would need to change the traction unit that goes into it. But we shouldn't mislead ourselves as to the timescales involved with this. If we were talking about the development and then commercialization and ruggedization of ammonia fuel cells, it is going to be comparable to the timescale of the life of some of these platforms. So it's not something that we're going to have to do tomorrow. It's a decade away as a challenge.
Thank you. And Professor Taylor, is there anything you'd like to add? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Lord Chairman.
Thank you very much. Baroness Blackwood, please.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Professor Greenwood and Professor Dodds were pretty clear in what they thought had been the relevant factors in driving forward research and development of batteries, and why the same had not happened to such an extent with fuel cells. So I think I sort of know the answer to this question, but do you think that there is a need for greater coordination across all the TRL levels in battery and fuel cell research? And do you think it would lead to greater success in the route to net zero? And my second question is, do you think that we have any gaps further upstream in making sure that we have identified sustainability in the supply chain? Perhaps Professor Greenwood would like to start.
So I would say, to answer your question about the linkages between the TRL level, I think we've mentioned a few times that one of the things that really makes the Faraday stand out internationally as a successful mechanism is that the connection between the TRL levels and the common governance between early stage academic research right the way through to the folks in government supporting inward investment for people coming to the UK to put a gigafactory in place. I think if we were to make fuel cells operate at the same speed, then that TRL linkage would definitely be worthwhile. In answer to your question about the upstream gaps, I think it's very easy to get focused on the big investments in all of this. So in batteries, we tend to focus on the gigafactories, huge 1 kilometre square, £4 billion investments. We mustn't lose track of the fact that those gigafactories need skilled people, but they also need supply chains, and those supply chains are industrial chemicals companies. They are people doing, in some cases, plastic molding, steel pressings, things that already exist in this country, but will need to move across into a new industry sector to support it as it grows. I think for the kind of the translation of conventional industry into new markets, I'm not too worried. Those companies are actively looking to do that today, and there are some mechanisms out there to support them. But the piece that worries me a little bit more is about making sure that we've got the conversion supply chain, companies that can do things like electrolytes, cathode and anode materials, foils, separators, all of the components that go into the battery. And in particular, a challenge there is one of timing. So Tony Harper, who was on earlier, probably talked about chickens and eggs along the supply chain. The challenge we have at the moment is these supply chains are quite linear, and each actor in the supply chain is looking at the one ahead of them before they make their move. So the battery manufacturing company is waiting for the car company to give them an order to buy the batteries. The supply chain company to the battery factory is waiting to see the battery factory there before it invests in something to make the materials for it, and their suppliers are waiting for a signal from them. So one of the things that we could do well as a government is to look at what we could do to de-risk those investment decisions all the way down the supply chain so that they march in step rather than waiting for the next one to move before they make their own decision.
Thank you, Professor Greenwood. Maybe Professor Dodds. Professor Greenwood answered on the link of TRL coordination through the fuel cell chain, but also perhaps between fuel cells and batteries. And then on the supply chain question, I mean, one of the sort of barriers to scaling, as I understand it, is the pure supply of raw materials. And I wonder if there is something around the reuse of those materials and increasing the sustainability of that market within the UK.
Okay, so on coordination, Professor Taylor mentioned electrolyzers earlier. Electrolyzers and fuel cells are very closely related, and it would certainly make sense to coordinate their developments. In terms of the technologies, you'll have a proton electrolyte membrane electrolyzer and a proton electrolyte membrane fuel cell, for example. And in some cases, their reversible fuel cells work both ways. So that's important. There's maybe some potential for coordinating with batteries too, particularly if you're thinking about applications. So systems engineering to build products that are going to use both batteries and fuel cells. In terms of the supply chain and the barriers, the fuel cell business is really very international. So Johnson Matthey, for example, is a FTSE 100 firm. It has a large fuel cell division that principally produces materials and membranes for fuel cell stacks, and they export worldwide. And when we surveyed companies, more than half the companies worked with overseas companies or institutions. So it's a really global business, and there's a lot of global links. And so if we look upstream for sustainability and for how the supply chain is actually working, from the UK, there's parts of it that will not exist, but that's because it works in the global sphere, and that's partly because there is no market in the UK, but there is markets in other countries. So those companies need to export in order to survive. In terms of raw materials, there's long been a focus on reducing platinum in fuel cells, both because it's potentially a limited supply and because it's high cost, and that's more or less happened. There's now far less platinum in fuel cells, and car manufacturers have gone from trying to reduce the cost of the fuel cell to just trying to reduce the cost of every part of the car. They don't worry as much about the cost of the fuel cell anymore because they've come down to a level where it's not worthwhile relative to other components, such as the fuel tank. But I imagine there still is some work required to understand all the raw materials that are required for fuel cells.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to let Professor Taylor in. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry, were you raising your hand, Professor Taylor?
Please, if I could just add a couple of comments.
Yes.
So to the question around integration across TRL levels, I think there's definitely scope to improve that quite significantly. I think that the catapult centres are important in that space, energy systems catapult, and also high value manufacturing catapult centres. I think they've got a big role to play. I think we can build on that. I think particularly in linking across with SMEs as well. I think it's easier working with large companies. I think it's quite challenging working with an ecosystem of small, medium size enterprises, and I think catapults can help an awful lot there. And then also just to say that I think the whole life cycle analysis, circular economy aspects here are very, very important. Reuse, recycling across fuel cells and batteries, and I think that needs more attention. And also the ethics of the supply chains as well. we can see that there are some real ethical problems with the supply of cobalt, for example, for battery technology at the moment, and we need to be cognizant of that.
Thank you very much.
There's certainly some more I could add on sustainability. I'm not sure if we're going to have time for it at the moment. Chair, it's entirely...
Yes, please, Professor Greenwood, please.
So if I may, there's three main things that we would want to do in order to improve the sustainability, particularly reduce the embedded carbon emissions associated with battery manufacture. The first one, which might seem odd, is to invest in charging infrastructure in the UK. And that's because if we do that, we can make the batteries smaller and lighter in the vehicles we have today, which means that they consume less energy to make. And that can be done without changing any of the battery chemistry or any of its manufacture. That's about putting an infrastructure in place that means we don't have to put a 600 kilogram battery in every car on the road. The second thing that we can do is to engineer out the materials which cause both ethical and embedded carbon challenges. So that's things like cobalt. And there is a very active research community in the UK looking at technologies like sodium ion, lithium iron phosphate, lithium sulfur, which don't have those strategically important materials within them and which are much cheaper and more sustainable to deal with. And then the third thing that we need to do is to put in place a very good recycling infrastructure, which is able to make sure that the materials we're embedding in systems today remain in the system. So we don't have to remine every time we want to create a next generation of product.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barnes Blackwood. Thank you, all of you, Professor Greenwood, Professor Dodds, Professor Taylor. Thank you for helping us with this today. It's been most informative. I need to stop because at 12 o'clock we have a minute's silence. So thank you very much and goodbye.